I'm Brittany Rowland, and I'm here today with Justice David Farris. We are here as part of the State Bar of Texas Oral History Program, interviewing the different retired and former justices of the various courts of appeals. And I'm honored today to be interviewing Justice Farris.
Good morning, Brittany.
Good morning. I thought that we would start kind of at the beginning and talk about your childhood, your background, what led you to ending up on the Court of Appeals, and then go through thereafter.
Well, we moved to Fort Worth from Kansas City when I was 5, and I grew up in Fort Worth, and always thought I might be a lawyer. Went to Baylor undergrad, and went in the National Guard, did my 6 months active duty, came back and went to law school.
And are there any interesting stories you want to share about your family or your parents? Or
Well, my dad was an electrician with the railroad, which is just a few blocks from here, was then, and he was probably one of the highest paid blue-collar workers. This is in 1945, right after the war. He made a huge sum of $325 a month, and that supported our family, and we bought a home over on the west side of Fort Worth.
Do you remember what the value of the home was?
No, I don't, but I probably paid less than $10,000 for it.
The only reason I ask
Yes.
is because my grandfather tells similar stories about his house that he bought after the war.
Well, that lot today would be worth several times what my parents paid for it.
I think that we talked about that you had some family members who served in various wars.
Well, I had an uncle who served in World War I. He had the flu. There was a big flu epidemic during World War I, and he did not go overseas because of that, and served out the rest of his military service as a mule skinner at, I think, Fort Riley, Kansas. And then I had 7 first cousins, all obviously quite a bit older than I am, or I was, and a maternal uncle who all served in World War II, and all of them survived it.
Wow.
So that was kind of fun. Exciting, not so much fun, but it's great to know they did survive, including 2 who were at D-Day, one with the 101st Airborne, and then I had a cousin who was on the battleship Tennessee at Pearl Harbor.
Wow. It's very interesting. And so you ended up in Fort Worth, and you went to high school in Fort Worth, right? Did you say that?
Yes, I did, Arlington Heights.
Arlington Heights. And then you went to Baylor for undergrad. What's your undergraduate degree in?
History.
History. And then after Baylor, you ended up joining the National Guard. What was the thought process behind that?
Oh, I was tired of school, and I wasn't really sure I wanted to go to law school. And a friend of mine said, "You face the draft," and that's tells you what time it was. So I went in the National Guard, did my 6 months active duty, started Baylor Law School as soon as I got out. And that kept me out of Vietnam. A lot of my classmates in law school ended up going to Vietnam when we all graduated.
Right. And wasn't there an interesting story, I think there is, about you in the National Guard and how you were chosen for a special program? Isn't that right?
Well, I was trained as a medic. Is that the story you're thinking of?
Yes, that is the story I was
Well, we did part of our physical there at the armory where I joined, and we had a medical platoon, and so if the medics liked you, they'd say put in for medics, because after leaving Fort Polk for basic training, you would go to Fort Sam Houston in San Antonio, and that was like a country club compared to most military posts, and I did that and got to enter the medic program. And then when I got out and went back to my National Guard unit, they no longer had a medical platoon, so they made me into a clerk typist.
There you go.
Yeah.
So you actually know how to type.
Well, sort of.
Okay, and so after that, you went to law school at Baylor. Is that right?
That's correct.
All Baylor lawyers. I'm a Baylor lawyer as well. We all have
Absolutely.
to ask each other, who was your practice court
Well,
professor?
mine was Frank Wilson.
Any funny stories about law school?
Frank Wilson was well, there is a story there. A lawyer who I knew well, and he was a year ahead of me at Baylor, had never known him to use profanity, once said that Frank Wilson was a son of a bitch. And when he was in practice court, and that scared me to death, because I knew this guy didn't swear, and it was sort of curious that he would say that about Wilson. And he was about the meanest man alive. But when I first had to deal with a particular federal judge who used to be well known in this area, he was on a tear, and I wasn't frightened.
Right.
Because Wilson had put us through it.
Right. You were well trained for
Yes,
that
we
kind of
were.
thing.
Absolutely.
I guess that's the point.
Yeah.
I find this interesting. How did you find out when you passed the bar exam? How did they notify people back then?
Well, there was always a rumor going around the bar grades were out, and people would hustle around and see if they could find out. I had completed law school and was in Fort Worth, and the woman who was then my fiance called me up and said, "You've passed the bar exam," and I did very well on it. So I thought, well, gee, now I got to get a job.
And how did she find out that you passed the bar exam?
She'd heard the rumor at Baylor. She was an undergrad at Baylor, and she had heard the rumor and talked to some law students, and I don't know, somehow she found out what my bar grade was.
Right. She may have called the State Bar of Texas herself, and
I don't know.
gave her the results. Who knows?
But she reported to me that I needed to find employment.
And you said, duly noted.
Yes.
Okay, so where did you begin practicing
Well,
law?
I worked with a law firm on the west side of Fort Worth called Dixon Alley and Petrovich, and I was with them, roughly 2 years, and then I moved downtown with a firm called Housen, Fluke and Gandy, and they did a large part of criminal practice, and so I did a good bit of criminal practice for a few years, and then made a couple of other changes that ultimately led to me being on the Court of Appeals.
Right. And so you practiced from what, 1965?
Well, actually, I started work after the first of the year in '66, and worked in private practice up until, when was it? '86, until the spring of '86. I had won the Democratic primary. There was no Republican in the race, and Governor Mark White, who was a law school classmate of mine, went ahead and appointed me to the position that was going to be mine anyway. And I served from '86 on.
Okay. Any interesting stories about campaigning for the Court of Appeals?
The first time I ran, I was defeated, and I lost to Bill Burdock, and hadn't run a very good race at all. And when I decided to run a second time, the second time, Clyde Ashworth, who held the position that I later took, called me and said that I should get in the race. So the first person I called was Bill Burdock, and I said, "Bill, how did you whip me as badly as you did?" And he told me he was disappointed in my campaign and that I needed to get out of Tarrant County and go to the other 11 counties, which I failed to do the first time. So I took his advice and won.
And won the second time around.
Yes.
Nice. When you were in private practice before joining the Court of Appeals, did you have any appellate experience?
I had quite a bit. I did civil and criminal. When I was with Housen, Fluke and Gandy, I did a lot of the appellate work, and a lot of it was criminal. And then after I left that firm, I went with a firm where I got a percentage. I got a salary plus a percentage of any work I brought in. So I would hustle criminal appeals and come in on a Saturday and produce a brief and get paid. It wasn't a lot of money, but you understand. But it was money that I got to share. So I really appreciated doing that work. And then I did the civil appeals with. I was in a loose partnership with Creighton Maynard, Dudley Beatles, Larry Wood, and I did their appellate work largely.
Right. Did you ever argue before the Texas Supreme Court
Yeah,
in your private practice?
I did. I've argued before the Supreme Court. I'm not sure how many times, 4 or 5 times.
And obviously the various courts of appeals.
I've argued before probably half of them, but either by arguing or by appearing on, or rather serving on them, I've been involved with most of the courts of appeals in the state, one time or another.
And so you served on the Fort Worth Court of Appeals from, I guess, June of 1986 to December 1994, if my notes are right.
That's right. I was one of the Democrats that was swept out of office in 1994.
Right. And what are you most proud of about your time serving on the bench?
I would have to say that I was able to help reduce the caseload. First of all, in the Fort Worth court, I led the court every year in a number of opinions written, and I'm kind of vain about that, I guess. Sounds vain. And then when I was served on the Dallas Court of Appeals, which I did for several years, their caseload was really a burden, and Barbara Rosenberg and I were both appointed almost full time to that court. In fact, each of us had a staff attorney assigned to us, And we reduced their caseload to it was, if you filed your Appellee's brief today, you got a letter saying come down in 2 weeks and argue it, and 30 days later you got an opinion.
Wow.
So those were heady days for the Dallas Court of Appeals.
Right. Wow, that's impressive. Okay, well, there's one topic that we need to cover. It's a bit of a sensitive topic, and so I wanted to let you kind of take the lead on what you talked about the topic, but it's the 1992 courthouse shooting. You were actually on the bench at the Court of Appeals the day of the shooting.
That's right. The panel was John Hill and Clyde Ashworth as a visiting justice, and I was on it as well. The other two were both wounded, as you know. John took a bullet. Clyde got shot twice, and a couple of young lawyers got murdered.
Right.
And I don't usually get this, but it's been that many years ago, but it's still something. Anyway, and just by the luck of the draw, where I was seated on the panel that day, I did not get shot.
Right. Wow.
And, go ahead.
No, I was just going to ask you, as a result of that day, how did the courthouse procedures change?
Well, it was interesting. We had no bailiff.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know that any appellate court in the state of Texas had a bailiff.
Mm-hmm.
Certainly none that I'm aware of. And after that, we had a bailiff. The first bailiffs they assigned us had difficulty staying awake through oral argument. So we all started wearing bulletproof vests on the Fort Worth court.
Really?
And I got a gun and started carrying heat to the bench.
Mm-hmm.
And I did that later as a visiting trial judge.
Right. And so the shooter, he was disgruntled because of a family law case of his. Is that what the backstory was?
Yes. I was crouched behind the bench listening to the gunfire, and I was thinking, this is a family law case. Mm-hmm. And of course I was right. Mm-hmm. His name was George Lott. Mm-hmm. He was an attorney, had gone to the University of Texas Law School, had not done well in his law practice, had lost his divorce, mm-hmm. representing himself, mm-hmm. Had appealed it. In fact, I was sitting on the panel sat on the panel that heard his oral argument, and then he first went into the trial courtroom. Justice Hicks, she was Judge Mary Ellen Hicks then, and she later served on the Court of Appeals. Mm-hmm. Then came up to the Court of Appeals, mm-hmm. And killed Chris Marshall, who was head of the Appellate section of the Tarrant County Bar. Mm-hmm. Really nice lawyer, and a young lawyer named John Edwards.
Mm-hmm. And the two people that ended up being killed were random, right? They
That's
had nothing to do with anything.
They had nothing to do with his case. John Edwards was there to make his first oral argument. Chris was over there to hear a young member of his staff in the DA's office make his first argument. Wow. His or her, I don't even remember which lawyer it was, but wow. He was shot almost immediately. Mm-hmm. Edwards ran from the courtroom and drew Lott outside. Lott killed him and left the building.
Mm-hmm. And then later was arrested and.
Yeah, he was arrested and was convicted. Mm-hmm. Called me as a witness, actually. Mm-hmm. And I was subpoenaed to appear and had to fly up to Amarillo and testify. Mm-hmm. The prosecutors then, I was trying to think of the names, Levy and Parrish, mm-hmm. Told me that he didn't know very much evidence law, and mm-hmm. that I could probably push him around a little bit when he asked me questions. And he would ask how questions and why questions, so I didn't have any difficulty testifying.
Mm-hmm. Wow. I can't imagine. So obviously that was a memorable case, serving on the Court of Appeals. Do you have any other memorable cases that were during your time on the bench? Anticipating that,
you would ask me that. I was going to look what case up, and I couldn't. I just forgot. Mm-hmm. I could have found it. But we had a case one time where some oil billionaire wannabes and gonna-bes, they thought, two of them flipped a coin for a sports car that was, I think, $100,000 or $200,000 in value. Now this is back 30 years ago. and the dealer lost the bet and gave up the title of the car and later stole it back. And there was a conversion lawsuit, and the winner also won the lawsuit, and the issue on appeal was whether or not it would be enforcing a gambling debt to sustain the conversion
suit of the winner of the bet.
Verdict. And we decided that no, that he didn't have to give up the car, but that once he did, it was no longer his to take back. And if you ever read that opinion, you will find that our authority supporting it is really thin. I'm not sure we decided anything. And also, I understand that from young lawyers that contracts law professors will say, oh, now here's an anomaly, and report that case, and it's never been cited so far as I know. But it was entertaining.
And then I think you had told me about another memorable case while you were on the Court of Appeals that had to do with the right of confrontation in child abuse cases.
Yes, right. The first few months after I came on the court, I was assigned a case that involved a state statute that restricted the right of confrontation in a sexual assault case involving a minor victim. And it was a tough case, and we heard argument on it, wrote an opinion, held the statute to be unconstitutional. There was a motion for rehearing, and we granted the motion for rehearing and actually set an en banc argument. We squeezed all 7 justices of the Fort Worth court behind the bench and heard argument and affirmed our earlier ruling.
During your time on the bench, did you have any favorite coworkers?
Oh, I had several, and I liked everybody I worked with, but to pick a few. First of all, David Kellner. David came on the court 3 months after I did, and we had a lot of fun together. In fact, we had a war. He was more into destroying my office, and I was more into sabotaging his. But David brought a water gun to the Court of Appeals. I brought a machine gun, water gun to the Court of Appeals. He got a machine gun. We had an arms race along. But David, of course, David is a genius. Everybody was in awe of David, and he was only 36 when he went on the Court of Appeals. But it was a lot of fun, a lot of experience, and I learned a lot from him. Just to pick a few others, Todd Weaver. Todd was the first Republican Chief Justice. He and Larry Myers came on the court together. It was kind of a thing of, is this going to be an issue? And Todd made sure it wasn't. Todd was a justice before he was a member of either party. And he called on me, put me to work, and he and I worked very well together. And I really appreciated Todd. I appreciated Larry as well, Larry Myers, who also went on that time. Hal Lattimore. Hal wasn't the most collegial of appellate justices. He had been on the trial court for so long that he kind of marched to his own drummer regardless. But I can still picture Hal showing up in the door of my office and holding one of my opinions in my hand and looking at me over the top of his glasses and saying, "You didn't really mean to say that, did you, sport?" And I would go back and go, "Well, probably didn't mean to say it quite that way." But Hal kept me out of trouble. And then with staff people, we had Jeanette Thompson, who was staff attorney and then later chief of staff attorney for the Fort Worth court. And I don't think we could have survived without her. Yvonne Palmer was our clerk, and she was fun and didn't take any nonsense off of us, and understood the procedure of a court of appeals better than we did. So actually, she was the boss. And then Deborah Spizak, the current coach. Deborah was just a kid when I went on the court. She'd only been there a couple of years, but Deborah we knew as somebody who never said, "We've never done it that way before, Judge." With Deborah, it was always, "We can make it work somehow." So we really appreciated Deborah, and I'm tickled to death she has that position.
What during the course of you served on your court and then rolled off, and then what other courts have you served on after that?
Well, I served on the second court again within the first month. John Casey, the incoming Chief Justice, let me know right away he was going to have me come back and visit, and he did. Served Alice Oliver Parrott got me down to the Houston First Court when she was the Chief Justice there. I served there. I served quite a bit in Beaumont. Served one panel in Eastland. Served on the Texarkana Court when a case where all three of the justices there had recused. And then there was a case in El Paso, before the El Paso Court of Appeals. The court had 4 justices then, but 3 of them took their pets to the same veterinarian, and he had a case on appeal, so they had to bring in 2 visiting justices to make a panel to hear argument in the case. So that's I've served on 7 of the 14 courts as a visiting justice.
Wow! And then you've also been asked to serve on various trial court benches as well, right?
I did. I served on several for a while. I haven't served at all, and now I'm over 13 years, but I did, and I seemed to draw the scary assignments. If it was somebody, the theory I was told was that I could duck faster than any judge in North Texas.
They knew you were good at that.
Yeah, and there were a couple of really scary cases, and I carried heat on the bench.
What perspective have you gained from sitting on all those different courts of appeals?
Well, I would say that the unanimity of approach, I mean, the way pre-submission conferences are held, the way post-submission conferences turn out, the likes and dislikes, particularly in briefs and in presenting oral argument, are the same on all 14 courts, or at least on the 7 that I have served on. And the good news for practicing attorneys is you read those papers on how to argue a case or how to write a brief, because they're right on. With the stuff you read in those is true, and to ignore those accepted rules is just not very smart at all.
Would you give me some examples? What are some good briefing tips that you would say?
Brevity. If I, as a justice, have a case before me, and one brief is this thick and one brief is that thick, guess which one I want to read.
Right.
And if you can, I view briefs as writing advertising copy. I mean, it's not like selling beer, but it is like trying to encourage somebody to give to public television, let's say. So you're trying to persuade 3 people or 9 people to do something, and to persuade them, you need to get their attention and impress them that your cause is just.
Right. And do you have any tips for oral argument?
The way I handle oral argument is I show up with the same little skinny loose leaf notebook. I've got 2 folders in it, 2 folder pages, separators, I should say, and then I put 3 or 4 sheets of blank paper, and then I'll have maybe as much as 2 pages of notes, and they're in 16-point type so I can read them, or at least be able to see them. And I anticipate arguing or actually presenting what I have written and what my initial ideas are in 2 to 5 minutes, and expect the panel or the court to take it from there. And if I'm through and they're not asking any questions, I thank them and sit down. I think that's a lot better plan than to go with, I've always seen these lawyers show up like this with 2 big, huge a trial
cases, right?
book. And I think, what are they going to do with that? I did when I was arguing, rather sitting on the bench, and I wonder now that the notebook is what works for me, but I would suggest to any lawyer, you need to reduce it to just a few pages. The other thing is if your referring attorney is there, ask her or him, please sit down, please don't approach me while I'm up making oral argument. And if you're going to do I'm going to leave the story for David Kellner. He has absolutely a priceless story on what to do in that situation. I hope you do his interview and ask him.
Okay, sounds good. Let's see, where have you worked since leaving the bench?
Well, I'm with a firm, Lively and Associates, and I do the appellate work for the firm, and help with some of the trial work, and that's about it. I'm real close to retirement.
And how, I find this interesting, how has the practice of law changed during your career?
When I got out of law school, the big firms in Fort Worth had what was called a MAG card. It was an IBM memory typewriter, and a really big firm by the standard of the day might have 2 of those, and they would have perhaps a second shift of secretaries come in at night and use them. We had secretaries, not paralegals, and that was the well, and plain paper copiers. Xerox still had the monopoly on plain paper copiers, so that was really it. In terms of technology, now we've added things that have come and gone since then. So that's a big change, and it's certainly helpful, except that before we had all of those time-saving advantages, we used to pick up the phone and talk to each other. And lawyers don't do that much anymore. I have cases where I'm perhaps helping on the trial level, and I never talk to the attorney on the other side. And I guess I'm at fault as much as the other attorney, but we don't pick up the phone and talk to each other.
And while we're talking about collegiality, that kind of leads me into another topic that I wanted to talk to you about, which was when you were practicing in private practice, I believe there was a big hangout for all of the attorneys. Where did everybody hang out together?
There was a hangout for primarily for plaintiffs' lawyers, but also for a few of the defense attorneys, civil defense attorneys, and a couple of criminal attorneys would come in. Mike Thomas, the criminal district judge, was one, but it was Angelo's barbecue, and there would be a crowd in there every afternoon, Monday through Friday, and insurance adjusters would show up, and cases would be settled at Angelo's. And in fact, Angelo agreed to the installation of a phone so that lawyers and adjusters could call the industrial accident board and report that a workers' compensation case had been settled, and that the hearing could be canceled, and that if the board would just send over someone with a compromise settlement agreement, we'd have the paper wrapped up as well.
I love that. And then y'all also played on a softball league?
Well, we wasn't a league. Aetna Insurance had a big presence in the casualty field back then, and we would see the Aetna adjusters down at Angelo's quite often, and they mentioned the fact that they had a co-educational softball team in their claims department. So we put together a team to play them, and our team, we even brought in a couple of ringers to kind of give us a little more power in the lineup. Didn't work. They thrashed us, but both teams picked an umpire. We picked a fellow who was a regular at Angelo's, and we pointed out that he was in the insurance business, and the Aetna folks said, well, yeah, he's a life insurance expert, not a casualty man. He's testified for most of the lawyers on your team on life expectancy, and he's blind. Well, we pointed out he was only blind in one eye.
Exactly, there's only one eye.
And then they got to pick an umpire, and they said, well, we have a young lawyer just out of law school who's now representing us, and his name was David Kilner.
And so was that the first day you met David Kilner?
That was it, at the game.
That's so
time.
Funny.
Yeah.
He was the young referee.
That's it.
Well, I kind of am wrapping up unless you have other things you wanted to talk about, but I wanted to ask you a couple of last questions, which was, what advice would you have for young lawyers?
Well, if they want to try lawsuits, jury trials, and because that's what they're seeing on television, they might want to consider going into criminal practice. Brittany, I went over to our new civil courts building on a Tuesday of a jury week, and I could find evidence of one jury trial. When I got out of law school, every civil district court would be in trial on a Tuesday of a jury week. So the trials have gone away, and I think largely that's the responsibility of lawyers and of courts and of the legislature. I think We have taken the courthouse as a remedy away from people of lesser means, working people, consumers, and the law now is largely there to protect power and wealth. And I'm sorry, but that's the way I sadly view it.
Do you have any advice for what we could do to remedy that?
Well, we may need, in the law practice, some bomb throwers, figuratively speaking, you understand, and people who need to stand up and be heard on this topic. But I also appreciate that if you're getting out of law school and you owe $8 bazillion, you've got to take the job that will help you pay off your loans, and your new employer may not want you to be a bomb thrower, and may be happy with the status quo.
Right. Well, all right. I think that about wraps it up of the questions I had, unless you can think of something I've forgotten.
That's it. Thank you very much. You're very gracious.
No, thank you for allowing me to do this.
Well, this is fun.
Well, thank you, and also thank you for your time on the Court of Appeals.
Well, thank you.